Now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Kopstein, who is the Dean's Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Irvine. He has held fellowships at several renowned universities and done research, lectured, and written books on several topics. But it is the subject matter of his last book, which is now out, which concerns us tonight. That book, The Assault on the State, How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future, directly concerns the upcoming election and Project 2025. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for Professor Kopstein.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as everybody who's spoken so far has said, we're living in, at a minimum, interesting times. I'm a scholar. I write books, I write articles. I don't tend to be very political. And I'm not political because my students who don't agree with me won't listen to me if they don't agree with me. So I try not to be political, and when I lecture, you can't really guess my views. Of course I have views. I have very strong views, but I try not to do that, unlike what everybody is saying is happening at universities. I don't do that. This is the first time I've ever written a political book. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it tonight because I think it directly concerns what's at stake in the election. But I want to tell you a little bit about how it came about. It came about during, and everyone here shared exactly this moment with me. It came about in spring of 2020. And we were home. All of us were home, right? We were home. We couldn't go out. We were watching our televisions. We were all worried about whether this was the end of civilization. We were going to die. All of us. Now, of course, we're all going to die anyway, but we were going to die next week or the week after, and many of us know people who died at that time. All too many people did. And it was at that moment, when our president came on television and told us all to drink bleach. He did, and several people did, and several people died. And while he was doing that, the greatest public health experts in the world, do you know where they were? They were sitting behind him. Deborah Birx put her head down into her hands. She later said it was the hardest moment of her life. She later said that 500,000 Americans died who did not need to die. All because there was no leadership. There was no leadership, and at that moment, I called my oldest friend from graduate school, who I've known for 33 years. We've written articles together. It's like we're an old married couple. He's at William and Mary. We complete each other's sentences, and I said, Steve, I want my state. I want my state. Where's my state? I want a kind of a Pentagon-level response to this. We didn't know. None of us knew exactly what it was required, but we wanted it to be very serious. We wanted the experts to be in charge. But the experts, as we all saw, were not in charge. And so we started writing op-eds. And we started saying something like, this guy's very bad for democracy. Everybody's saying that. Everybody in this room is thinking that. And we said, that is a problem. We agree that's a problem. But there's a further problem. In some ways, it's a worse problem. Or at least the two problems are connected. And that is, he and others like him appear intent on wrecking the state. Wrecking the state. And what would that mean, wrecking the state? What would that mean for all of us? And so I'm going to do something I never actually, I'm doing a read of the room. I'm not going to go through my boring slides really slowly because that would be an academic talk. So the most important thing, the book just came out like today. I got it in the mail. It's my copy. You can't get a copy for a month, apparently, but you can order. So my agent, I've never had an agent before. The agent said, the important thing is to tell them not that they read the book, but that they buy the book. It works. That works. He said that would work. So what I'm going to do, I want to read the first 2 pages. And then I'm going to go to a few of my slides. And you'll see there's too many words on the slides. It's too small of a screen for this kind of room. I didn't know any of that. That's totally cool. You'll see where I'm going. I'm not boring, you can tell so far. Okay. Americans love to hate the state. It is difficult to find anyone in American politics who defends the positive contributions of state bureaucrats to our way of life. On the left, democratic socialists see the state as an instrument of wealthy corporate interests, while anarchists continue their quest to smash the state entirely. On the right, Christian nationalists and supporters of enhanced presidential executive power have allied to undermine the power of the secular administrative state. Meanwhile, influential billionaires promote the staunchly anti-statist philosophy of libertarianism at think tanks, universities, and chambers of commerce across the country. Sometimes the hatred of the state can take fanciful forms. Silicon Valley tech mogul Peter Thiel, who happens to be J.D. Vance's patron, for example, has allied with Petri Friedman, grandson of the famed libertarian economist Milton Friedman, to promote the concept of seasteading, that is, the creation of voluntary cities on the ocean outside of any state's jurisdiction, made up of individual floating homes that can redock elsewhere whenever the local seasteading rules get too oppressive. And extremist groups promoting the sovereign citizen movement, which claims that states have no legal authority over individuals whatsoever, have grown significantly since the COVID-19 pandemic. Given all of these diverse movements depicting central government as the mortal enemy, it is no wonder that the belief in the existence of a global deep state conspiracy to stamp out human liberty is at an all-time high. But as annoying as state bureaucrats and government experts sometimes are, all of us depend on them to live what we now consider normal lives. Like the air we breathe, government agencies are mostly invisible, but without them, we would all be in grave danger. Without them, our food, water, and air would be poisonous, our money worthless, our children taught by incompetence or worse, our votes uncounted, and our national security violated. What if we no longer had legally constituted states, qualified experts, or well-organized bureaucracies to keep us secure, healthy, and democratic? What if we were to revert in the 21st century to pre-modern forms of personalistic rule? Not so long ago, kings, queens, and royal children, grand viziers, and various hangers-on responded to public health crises, natural disasters, and questions of national security with quack remedies, consultations with oracles and soothsayers, or casting blame on impure outsiders. My family was an impure outsider. This was considered normal, and the results were horrifying. Millions of needless deaths in plagues, floods, and genocides. In the modern world, a return to this sort of rule would threaten the very survival of our species. And as unlikely as it sounds, we are far closer to that precipice than most people imagine. That's the kind of motivational reason why we wrote this book. We're worried. The book's a bit of a downer, I'll grant you that. But I think sometimes it's important to kind of face up to the true stakes. It's not so much that leaders around the world are trying to get power and keep power undemocratically. But the question is, what do they do when they have power? What do they do? What kind of damage is done? That's what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. The relationship, and I'm going to talk for about, 25 more minutes, the relationship between what's happening globally and what's happening here in the United States. Because what's happening here in the United States right now, it's not all that unusual. We're not exceptional as we think. I mean, we're exceptional in that everybody's special, right? As Barney the dinosaur said. We're all special. But we're not exceptional in that the kinds of things that are happening in the United States are happening in other countries too. And that's important to think about in order to kind of situate, if we're going to actually solve the problem, we have to actually know what the problem is. Okay, so it's interesting that the notion of the deep state, this idea that there's secret cabal of people really pulling the strings, this is a very old idea. But in the modern world, it's interesting, it started off on the left. It started off on the left in Turkey. People found out that there actually were people in Turkey who were getting together, such as politicians, mafiosi, army officers, in order to deal with what they consider to be political enemies. And it was the left that spotted this, and they said, not only does Turkey have a deep state, Egypt has a deep state. And the United States is actually backing them all. This was a kind of standard. I went to Berkeley. One of my professors at Berkeley was one of the propounders of this. Right? And, I mean, we ignored him for the most part. But this is what he said. That idea that there are unelected people who are secretly behind the scenes pulling the strings, it moved over the last 25 years to the political right. And in the United States, Steve Bannon was the one who first said, what we are going to do is to smash the administrative state, to smash the deep state. It's interesting, this idea of smashing the state, it's fascinating. Do you know who first said that? Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. I'm a Russia specialist, right? Steve is too. So this was where it started, but in the US case, you also got a kind of an unholy alliance of three groups who shared one thing in common. They disliked the state. In the first case, libertarians, who believe everything would be wonderful, freedom would flourish if we would just get rid of almost the entire state completely. Maybe with the exception of the police, but even that could be privatized. Christian nationalists, the second group, who believe that the state promotes secular rights independent of religion. And third, as we've recently found out in our courts, I mean, we wrote this 2 years ago, those who believe that there should be unfettered executive power. If the president does it, it is legal. This is what Nixon wanted, by the way. And in some ways, what we're seeing now in the courts is Nixon's revenge. We're seeing the declaration by judges who are part of the Federalist Society, who are the inheritors of the old Nixon administration. Those of you, everybody here is old enough, of course, to remember the Bork case. This is the revenge for Bork, for not appointing Bork to the Supreme Court. Now, of course, what's interesting is those three groups, they don't always get along. I mean, you can imagine, if anybody here ever been to a Republican convention? I have, not as a member, as a student, right? As a student, look, the Democratic conventions are weird too, but the Republican conventions are weird in their own way. You have three groups of people. You have Christian conservatives, you have libertarians, and you used to have national security conservatives. They're not really that important in the Republican Party anymore. But so it's weird. You have the people in the one corner praying and the other corner getting high. Right? So they don't actually always get along. Nor would they get along. But the one thing they can all agree on is they don't like the modern state. They'd like to get rid of it. Trump. Most people argue that Trump is an authoritarian populist, right? That is, he appeals to the little guy, but in order to rule as an authoritarian. That's probably true. But without the legally constituted state, the kind of authority that we have would not necessarily be only authoritarian. After all, authoritarians love elections. They only like to win elections. They don't like to lose them. The kind of authority that we have is what political scientists sometimes call patrimonial. That is, the rule of the strong man, the rule of the daddy, of the father. And who does the father appoint? Friends and family. Friends and family. Not experts. Not bureaucrats. Not civil servants. But what Trump called only the best people. And only the best people turned out to be Jared, and Jared, and Jared, and Ivanka, and his gang. Now, it is true that all presidents appoint people that they think are going to carry out their wishes, that share their basic ideas. Trump is not interested. Patrimonials are never interested in ideas. They're interested in personal loyalty, personal fealty. Think of the image that I'd like to spread out there. It's Don Corleone and the Five Families. That's the idea. Okay, let me push on. Okay, so that's the issue here. I'm going to skip over this slide. Most people who are worried about Trump are worried about democracy. I'm worried about democracy too. But I'm more worried about what that kind of person is going to do to our state. This democracy-autocracy divide draws attention to is the leader elected, how the leader comes to power. But most people don't pay attention to what leaders do once they do come to power. Okay. So this is what the very famous sociologist, and you're going to get a little sociology here, I'm sorry. Max Weber, German sociologist, one of the fathers of sociology, called patrimonialism. That is, for most of human history, we did not have legally constituted states. They did not exist. Political authority was done on the basis of individual, personal relations, relations of devotion, of affection, but not of law. Law was not that important. And so, in its purest form, patrimonialism is really ruled by the leader with his family and friends. We used to look at the third world. When you guys went to college, we used to look at the third world and say, you know, they're trying to have democracies, they're trying to have modern states, but ultimately they're very corrupt. Who here has ever heard of Ethiopia's Haile Selassie? Do you know Haile Selassie, who's the emperor of Ethiopia? You might know this. He used to have a guy who just followed him around everywhere he went, so when he sat, would put a cushion under his feet so the royal tootsies didn't dangle in the air. That was the nature of political authority. The nature of political authority was the worship of individuals. And we looked at the rest of the world and we said, yeah, you know, they're trying to be democratic, but they're not very good at it. They're poor, they're tribal, they're not advanced like we are. But that's not what happened, my friends. What happened is not that they became more like us. What happened, weirdly, is we started becoming more like them. We started becoming more like them. Now what you have in advanced democracies is the resurrection of patrimonial rulers, patrimonial authority, or at least those who are competing for power to get there, who will make the states their personal playthings. Britain, Israel, the United States, Italy, France. Even when they're not in power, they're threatening to come to power, or, as we know, to return to power. it really started this new wave, believe it or not, in Russia. In Russia. The fall of communism coincided in Russia with a kind of a consensus that everybody's just going to have a free market and everything's going to be wonderful. But that's not how it went. Russia became impoverished and open to a new daddy figure who came to power at the end of the 1990s, Vladimir Putin. And what Vladimir Putin proceeded to do was, I'm not saying that he bought off leaders around the world. It's not that simple. That's the Russia, Russia, Russia thing that Trump talks about. It's true when he discredits it in that way. But what he doesn't note is that there's a kind of affinity between these kinds of leaders around the world and Putin. There's a reason he admires Putin. He wants to be like Putin. And what does Putin want? What does Putin want? Why did he invade Ukraine? Putin wants a world of other Putins, of little Putins, all around the world. Think of the five families again, with Don Corleone. That's what he wants in Ukraine. Ukraine could be its own country. You would simply have to have the sub-Don ruling Ukraine. That was his model. Russia back then faced the same challenges back in the 1990s as we in the United States started to face after the 2008 financial crisis. A hollowed out middle class, the seeming challenge to our sovereignty, large amounts of immigration, and this opened the way to this new kind of daddy figure who said, I can fix it all. Or as he put it, only I can fix it. Only I can fix it. And it diffused from there. It diffused to Belarus. That's where my family's from. And I went there. They have a guy who's running that place called Alexander Lukashenko, who's a former collective farm chairman. He's a little mini Putin. Azerbaijan, Chechnya, Ukraine before Zelensky. All of these places were essentially falling into line. And then Orban's Hungary. Now, the irony in all of this in the case of Hungary is before Hungary joined the European Union had spent a decade building a rule of law state, a normal Western-style state. Viktor Orban comes to power in Hungary, and the first thing he does is he dismantles that state. You will recognize this. He appoints the right judges. He unseats bureaucrats. He destroys the civil service. He wrecks their healthcare system. This is actually also what happens in Israel. It's interesting in the case of Netanyahu. And I'm not making a whole stand on the Israel-Palestinian conflict here. That's a different lecture. Netanyahu, the Likud in Israel, was actually a very rule of law party. Even more rule of law than Labor historically. They were ties, they were into law, they classified themselves as lawyers. But by 2015, Netanyahu decided Trump had the formula. Putin had the formula. And he started to become more like that too. Wrecking his own civil service, in many ways wrecking his army. The UK under Boris Johnson, with the EU cast as the deep state, the secret power behind the scenes, pulling the string. And they left the EU. Recent polls show that the vast majority of Brits regret leaving the EU. Because it provided the basic framework, the rule of law, in which the normal lives that we all lead can take place. Which brings us to the US under Trump. And if there's anything about this book I'm most proud of, is that we predicted this. Not that we predicted Trump. We wrote it while Trump was in power. But we argued that if he comes to power, he had spoken of once they were removed from power, and I say removed from power, because the election wasn't dispositive in this case. Once Trump was removed from power, the people around him started talking about a little-known decree, presidential directive, that he put into place just before he left office, called Schedule F. And what Schedule F, in effect, did was give the president the ability to wipe out aspects of the civil service. Now, he'd already done this in little ways, but things that you might not have heard of before. Did you know the Department of Agriculture? Anybody here ever been to DC? That big building, the Department of Agriculture, right next to the Holocaust Museum, across the street. It's gigantic. It has the largest cafeteria in all of DC, right? And it's, I believe, I could be wrong on this, it's the second largest, the Department of Agriculture is the second largest department after the defense. Immediately upon getting elected in 2016, Trump's people sent in political appointees all over the bureaucracy. All over the bureaucracy. Some of which, and said, look, we're not going to listen to you anymore. There's the door. Many people left. Some of you have heard of what happened at the State Department, where many of America's senior diplomats chose to retire. These are irreplaceable people, right? People who know foreign languages, who've been involved in intelligence. They're completely irreplaceable. But things you probably haven't heard of is at the Department of Agriculture. They decided to shift the entire research department, which is gigantic, to where? Kansas. To Kansas. A third immediately quit. Because they didn't want to move to Kansas. I mean, really, I would have quit too. But it wasn't only that. They saw the writing was on the wall. The writing was on the wall. That that department does, that research and development thing does everything from, crops and crop health, child nutrition. It does really important stuff. And they've never been able to replace these people. And it's small things that you don't see like that. But when you want your state, when you need your state, you're not going to have it. It's not going to be there. They're going to be pulling levers. And even if Trump comes to power, at some point or another, he's going to pull a lever. He's going to want to pull a lever. And it's going to be not attached to anything. Which comes to Project 2025. As was noted at the outset, this is a ginormous document, right? Drafted mostly by people at the Heritage Foundation, which was deeply involved with the election and staffing of almost every Republican president, but was mostly kind of old-style Republicans. And over the last 4 or 5 years, the Heritage Foundation has basically become a MAGA research institute. Project 2025 takes that tiny bit of Schedule F, which was put in at the end of at the end of the Trump administration, which Biden got rid of immediately to restore the civil service, and to make it much, much larger. Now, part of me thinks, I'll be honest, I don't actually believe they're going to be able to do this. I mean, it's too crazy. What do they think is going to happen here? Where are seniors going to get their health care? What's going to happen to our air, our water, our educational system? There's a nice phone going. That's all right. You can turn it off. So we don't know what's going to happen there. It's a serious issue. So what are we going to do about this? The first thing to do is to say the diminishment of the state, that is the destruction of the state. We're not talking about I'm not saying that everywhere should be run like the post office. That's not my point. Although the post office is pretty good. When we don't have the post office, we'll regret that too. Talk about voting. I'm not saying that everything should be run like the Department of Motor Vehicles, although that's not bad either. What I am, and I'm not saying we shouldn't argue about what is the proper level of tax rates, high, low, medium, what should our write-offs be? Those are all subject to discussion. Those are good things to argue, to debate, even within the Democratic Party. That's fine. That's good. But what we should not be doing is stepping back and saying, you know what? The state needs to be eliminated. In retrospect, that aspect, which Reagan started talking about, but it was even before Reagan, of course. It goes all the way back to Goldwater, really. But which Reagan started, talking about in earnest, I think he would be horrified at the actual destruction of the state, the getting rid of the civil service. I don't think that's what anybody ever intended. We're going to get much, much more than we bargained for. And so what you end up with, once you get rid of the state, is not a flourishing of freedom, is not Christian fundamentalism, is not unlimited executive power. Remember, Trump's going to pull on that lever. It's not going to be attached to anything. What you're going to get is not the rule of law, but the rule of men. The opposite. It goes all the way back to Aristotle, if you will recognize that expression. The rule of men. That's what we got rid of 250 years ago. We built states. States are contingent. They didn't have to come about. In much of the world, they never did come about. But we got lucky in the West. Those states provide us with public goods that markets need to function. Being pro-free market does not mean you're anti-state. You want a state. You want it to be there. You want the roads. You want the educational system. You want all of those things. Without a state, you won't have any of them. They're gone. And it's not clear we'll ever get them back. It was a contingent process. Do you know who understands you need a state? The Chinese understand. They provide public goods. Now, I'm not saying we should be them at all. But what I am saying is the road to Palookaville, the road to national weakness, the road to national defeat lies not simply through electing authoritarians. It's through electing authoritarians that see the state as just another aspect of a family business. And that's what this is. They view it as part of the family business. I don't think I've ever been this political in public before. I'm not sure I'm comfortable, but that's okay. So I wanted to thank you for your attention. I only have one copy of the book. It's not actually out for a month, so you can order it. I'm happy to take your questions. I'll try my best to answer them.
We have the first question here. Talk about crippling the state. The Supreme Court just did, in 5 cases in late June, to cripple the state, did more to cripple the state than Project 2025, plus Trump, plus Vance and GOP could ever do in 25 to 2028. Comment?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot there, so let me just comment on one aspect of it. The Supreme Court's ruling against the administrative state, it's important to understand what they're actually up to there. It's very important. We have in the United States legislation, right? Legislation on, we have a state, we have an incredibly complex society. There's 300 and some odd million of us here. There's no way that any legislation could encompass everything that needs to be done. So what we have is we have legislation that empowers bureaucracies to say, look, you're supposed to do this, and you're supposed to make rulings. And those administrative rulings, whether it is how long the Social Security office stays open during the week, we don't have legislation on that. What chemicals are allowed to be polluted at what level? There's no legislation on that. That's the EPA. where the border posts are actually supposed to be located, at San Ysidro, at blah, blah, blah. That's not, there's no legislation on that. That's ruled on by the people who run the border posts. What this Supreme Court ruling in effect did is to say, get this is very important, is to say Congress is not allowed to delegate that authority to the bureaucracies. Now, okay, I can see at some level that if the bureaucracies were completely arbitrary, if they're like rounding people up in giant numbers and throwing them in jail and sexually abusing them and take away their clothing and food, I could see how the Supreme Court might step in and say, look, Congress can't delegate that. But that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is the normal activity of the state that all of us require. And why this ruling was made? This ruling was made, and I think the clearest statements on this are from Senator Sheldon Winehouse. This ruling was made in the service of companies that don't want to be regulated. But regulation, the problem with going against regulation is it's against capitalism. Capitalists want regulation. They want it because it's the only way of building trust in the system. We know that we can build houses here in California and we're not going to wreck each other's property. We're not going to take each other's views. We know that. I live in Laguna Beach. That's a whole industry. Capitalism requires regulation. It doesn't make me anti-capitalist. My dad's a businessman. Of course not. This is a kind of an extremist ideology which has infected part of our political spectrum in the United States, so that 6 of the 9 justices can actually get up there and say, Congress doesn't have the right to delegate administrative authority to bureaucracies? Our society won't function if they actually do that. I find it hard to believe that they will. Now, you got to read, of course, it's so boring, you could pass out. But you got to read, the devil's in the details with all of this. What exactly is Congress not allowed to delegate, right? They're still playing a bit coy on that. They're pressing at the edges because they know if they actually do this, you're not going to get your Social Security. You're not going to, they're going to build villages where the houses all fall because nobody's going to be there. Right? So they know all of this, but they're sort of committed. And so that's what I mean by destroying the state. It's kind of at the edges, and at some point or another, we're really going to want it. It's different from Trump standing up there and waving his arms. What they are actually doing, the people who know what they're doing, who know the details, they're quietly hollowing out the very human institutions that we need to survive.
This question asks if you've heard about the movie Bad Faith. This is a movie about Christian nationalism.
I heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
It's a great movie.
I will. I'll watch it.
When Biden wins, the Supreme Court will act to nullify the election and votes. What can the state do to prevent such action? Many thanks for an excellent talk.
Thanks for the thanks. I did wing it a little bit once I looked at the crowd. No, it's a great crowd. It's super smart, but okay. Anyway. It's a difficult question. I noticed Biden, was it today or yesterday, called for new rules on the Supreme Court. Today? So legislation, basically ethics legislation and some other piece of legislation having to do with the Supreme Court. Term limits, 18 years, exactly. And I'm not sure what that's going to solve. The problem is that there is no real solution to this, and everybody already said it here, is to democracy, to get up there and vote. Now, the problem is our vote itself depends upon state institutions to be counted correctly. That's why I'm so worried. Because the problem's probably not going to be this time, but I mean, when Trump's elected, and he's been told, now, the Supreme Court ruling on executive power, you got to read it carefully. It was on core functions. The president is not subject to law for core functions. Now, what are core functions? They left that vague. They said that's up to Judge, was it Chutkan? The lower court judge. Chutkan, I think, to interpret. But once that's interpreted, then the Supreme Court will step in again. Now, we don't know what they're going to do. It could be that Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett, say, no. It can only be for a restricted realm of things, that this is going to be Nixon light. The danger, it's going to be as if Nixon got to do everything he wanted to do, right? That's, to my mind, the real danger. So I don't know a clean way out of this. The election is very important. I mean, I'm like you. I'm exactly like you. I was talking to my co-author this afternoon. I said, I'm talking to all these kind of smart Democrats tonight, and maybe they'll buy a book. And I said, part of me wakes up in the morning, I think, okay, so it's Nixon. It's not that bad, right? Maybe liberal intellectuals like me were panicking back in I was 7 years old in '68, so maybe we're panicking, right? It was bad. And then Steve was the one who said, yeah, it is sort of like Nixon winning, would be like Nixon winning again, but it would be like Nixon winning again where Judge Sirica wasn't there. There was no judge. The courts are all gone. And anything when the president does it, it is legal. That's the concern. It's clearly a gigantic concern, right? And I suppose that's why we're all here. Okay.
There's a couple of international questions. One is somebody that was shocked that India's president talked to Putin, and questions about what's going to happen in Ukraine if Putin has his way. What's going to be the effect on the U.S. on treaties, our international situation?
Let me go to the kind of Russia and Ukraine, because I really know that stuff. I speak Russian. I've been there many, many times. The big winner of the last 2 weeks has been Putin. Gigantic winner. He must be dancing. It's like when you get this when you win the lottery and you're kind of like, you're quiet, because you don't want to like tell anybody, or you're really happy, but he's not. They must be extremely happy, because not only as Trump said that he's going to stop funding Ukraine, but of course Vance is even more staunchly, J.D. Vance is even more staunchly against Ukraine. And if Ukraine, here's the real danger, I think. If Ukraine falls, which it could, if Ukraine falls, that will mean you have all of these NATO countries, right, bordering a Russian imperial project of some sort. And what's wrong with that? Well, on the one hand, that's what NATO's there for, right, is to protect against that danger. But here's the trick with NATO. NATO is based on one important fiction. It's not really a fiction, but it's a sort of a commitment which we hope never has to be met, and that's Article 5. And it's the idea that an attack on one is an attack on all, and it entitles us, it doesn't force us, but entitles us to then get involved. Do you believe that Trump will get involved? I mean, the idea there is that then NATO, if NATO itself is destroyed, then the global order, the global order itself, the order that we grew up in, and I'm not saying the United States. Look, I'm a Democrat. The United States hasn't always done well by the rest of the world. Everybody sort of knows that. In the United States, it's aircraft carriers, it's connections to other countries, it's kind of lattice work of treaties around the world. You may like it, you may hate it. It's sort of like Windows, right, on your computer. The United States is the Windows of the world. It's the operating system of the world. It's the operating system that's basically made the world that that I grew up in, the world that I know, the world that I saw as being more and more open, not without prejudices. And my family faced them when I was little. But they sort of went away. And I always was more optimistic because the world was becoming more and more open. But if that all gets destroyed, remember, he's against the state, but he's also against other international institutions. You can name them all. He's an anti-institutionalist. It's all just about him and the other heads of the 5 families. Don Putin, Don Bolsonaro, right? And if we proceed to that world, I don't see how, maybe it won't happen fast, but for my sons and their sons, that, it'll be, as Hobbes said, life could become nasty, brutish, and short. That was the world. That's what Hobbes said, why we have a state. So that the world is not nasty, so that the life is not nasty, brutish, and short. And so I worry about that. I worry about it a great deal, and I think you should too. I know NATO's not always fair, and it's not a perfect institution, right? But this lattice work of organizations of which NATO, the main security institution of the global order, if that gets deconstructed, what are we going to do? What are the Europeans going to do? Why wouldn't the Germans get nuclear weapons? I would if I were a German. You got Putin right next door. Of course you get nuclear weapons. The United States isn't guaranteeing your security anymore. Not one drop of American blood is worth it, Trump, whatever, would say. So I worry a great deal about that. That was the basic question, wasn't it, about NATO? Yeah.
Kim takes South Korea, and she takes Taiwan, and the rest of the world.
I'm going to combine 2 here. One is, how come nobody seemed to notice this until recently? You went through some of the precursors. And then following on, how can we educate those who don't understand this to espouse and act upon it?
Why do we know? Sorry, go ahead, please.
Maybe there's a third part that fits here. Is one way out for Congress to take back its powers?
Let me answer that last part first. I don't have a problem with Congress taking back its powers, but that's also rhetoric that the Republicans use against the idea of the administrative state. I mean, I'm for the administrative state. I want to be clear about that. A controlled one, not an overweening one, but like getting rid of it, that's meshuggah. I mean, that's nuts. And so, yes, Congress should, in the case of a president that tries to exercise too much power, I mean, the Article 1 powers of Congress are pretty strong. They're pretty powerful, right? But, are we going to get into a kind of constitutional showdown about this? That could actually happen. So the first 2 questions were about
Precursors, how come nobody knows?
how come nobody knew about this before me? Well, no. People had talked about it a bit. There was so when Trump first came to power, there were very interesting discussions about staffing about staffing the White House. Who is he going to get? And he said, all the best people, right? And then he made some weird choices, quirky choices, like that guy who was the head of Exxon. What was his name? Rex Tillerson, who ultimately got alienated by, and then he surrounded himself with people who looked like generals, right? Because he liked kind of central casting idea. He liked all his generals, but his generals ultimately sort of said, you're not allowed to do half the things you want to do, right? And then he got angry at Mattis, he got angry at his chief of staff. He got angry at 2 chiefs of staff, at McMaster and Kelly. So he got mad at all of these people. So there was this very interesting discussions of how is he going to staff. And that's what kicked it into my mind. This idea, I started looking back and saying, what's going on here? Because I'm a historical social scientist. I read about the past a lot. I said, that's exactly what happened, 400 years ago royal viziers had trouble, kings had trouble staffing their people. And so what they did is they chose family. That's where royal families come from, right? They needed all these people. And so I said, well, that's what he's going to do. That's what we're going back to. And then, of course, it was a hypothesis, and I wrote an op-ed or two, and then Steve wrote an op-ed or two, and then we said, this is a problem. And everybody we mentioned it to, this is the interesting thing about the kind of the journey of this book. So it's very interesting. We wrote a couple of op-eds, and then we got asked to testify before the January 6th Commission on how does getting rid of the bureaucracy influence the ability of foreign leaders to influence the executive branch. And we made the argument before, we didn't go before the politicians, we went before the lawyers and all the sharks on the committee, right? And so we went there and we said, well, you know, the problem is if you get the bureaucracy sort of insulates the president from foreign influence. It's a good thing. You want that bureaucracy there. And we made that argument, and it sort of got out, and then an agent contacted us. And then the agent said, we said, sure, we'll write a book. We'll need 4 years to do that, yada, yada, yada. And the agent said, don't. He said, you don't know what a popular book is. I said, no, I've never written one before, right? So sit down, no research, just write the damn thing. So we did. And we wrote it, and the argument that we started making, right? So the original argument was patrimonialism on the cover, and the agent said, no way, no one knows the meaning of the word. You can't have that on the cover, right? He couldn't even pronounce the word. And so, but it was hard to get people, it was hard to get people to buy the argument that the danger is not simply that of the danger to democracy. The danger is actually much more slow-moving and in some way worse. And it took us a couple years to figure out how to say that in normal English so a dentist in Iowa would read it. And yeah, so that's, you know, it's a simple idea, ultimately. But simple ideas sometimes take a long time to hatch. So I think that's the answer.
Well, other than reading your book, how can we educate those who don't understand this to espouse and act upon it?
You know, I think this is, you know, again, I'm not a political strategist. So where's the president of the organization here again? Sorry, raise your hand. No. Over here. Not here. I think you hit it right on the nose, right? You hit it right on target, and that is by focusing on Project 2025. And the clearest thing, the clearest evidence why that's so important is Trump immediately said what he always does. I don't know who these people are, right? You know, who are they? It was all his like leading advisors, right? You know, so I think why is it important to focus on that? Because that is the blueprint. The important part of that blueprint is not the attack on democracy. That's bad enough. It's there. The important part of the blueprint is the search and destroy mission on the state, right? And that is what they needed 900 pages to say. They needed, because our state, look, you can't have a society like ours without a large, sprawling organization that does all of this stuff. Think about it. Just think about it for a minute. And I think in order to stop this, we need to start educating ourselves again about the basics. The basics, not simply the Constitution and the separation of powers, as important as that is, but about the kind of society that we live in, the requirements to live as we do. And that, yeah, of course there's waste. Yes, and the waste should be gotten rid of, and we should work on that, and politicians should be punished for being corrupt. Today was another day on that, I guess, and wasteful. That's fine. That's all good. But that doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater. Because without that, we're toast. We're completely toast. And so I think, you know, of course, buy the book, but you don't need to buy the book in order to make that argument. Just get people to actually think through the implications of what they're saying. Because what they're mostly saying is that government sucks, taxes should be low. Fine, I don't like paying taxes either. Who likes paying taxes, right? But what's the alternative? You don't want to pay taxes? I got a place for you. In Haiti, they don't collect taxes. And it'll be fine. You'll just need a private army to guard your house, but it'll be fine. So we have this orderly administrative state, and some places are more orderly than others. Some states actually work pretty well in the United States, the local level states. I go through the United States a lot, and they do. Some places worse than others. But that doesn't mean we don't need it. We desperately need it. And so I want the American people to kind of educate themselves about what their state is actually doing, what it's actually doing. So many of us, I bet many people in here made careers within the state. Just raise your hand if you did. Yeah. I think this is important because we need to encourage people to go into the state. To go into the state. Not everybody has to be, or should be, God forbid, should be Elon Musk. Not everybody should be. We need people within our state. Some societies actually value their state workers. And they do much better, actually, than us. Important things. I'm not saying we should be like them. We're America. We're never going to be like them. That's fine. But let's not throw away what we achieved since the 1920s or 30s. It's very important stuff.
If I may be permitted to make a personal comment here, I used to work for Health and Human Services for 24 years, and I read the section of 2025 on HHS. I was horrified. It's exactly what Professor Kopstein has described. Just throw it all out and put some family in there to do what Donald wants. It's really terrifying. I want to thank him. I think it was really an inspiring, motivating, terrifying talk, and we really, really appreciate it.